Do you believe that fire can put out more than bodies? That can burn evidence, destroy truths, and hide secrets that no one should ever discover? On a cold December morning in 1945, as American families prepared for Christmas, tragedy was taking shape in Fayetteville, West Virginia. A house began to burn down in flames with 9 children inside. When the sun finally rose, 5 of them had disappeared. Not to the hospital, not to the morgue, but to nothingness. This is no longer a cold case, nor a made-up horror tale. It's a true story. A mass disappearance inside the family's own home, with a trail of questions choked by ashes. And the more you dig into this history, the more it looks back at you, as if it were alive, as if it still breathes through every missing document, every silenced witness, every disturbing detail that doesn't close the equation. You're about to dive into one of the strangest, most tragic, and most poorly explained cases in American history: a fire, a destroyed family, and a mystery that to this day defies logic, science, the police, and sanity. The case of the Soder brothers is not just a tragedy. It is a complete collapse of what should be the protection of the home, justice, and truth. The scene that started as a house fire became a dark theater of inexplicable flaws. A ladder that disappears just as the father tries to save his children. 2 trucks that worked perfectly. And suddenly, at the critical moment, they refuse to call. Call to the fire brigade that just doesn't happen. An answer that arrives 7 hours after the first flash. And even stranger, no human trace in the rubble. Not a bone, no teeth, not a single biological trace, as if those 5 children had evaporated into thin air. But what if they didn't evaporate? What if they were never there when the fire started? What if the fire was just a backdrop, a disguise designed to cover up something much darker? This story carries all the ingredients of a nightmare impossible to forget. Sabotage, direct threats before the tragedy, suspicious movements on the night of the fire, disconnected speeches of local authorities, alleged apparitions of children in other cities, clues that emerge decades later, and even a detective who disappears in the middle of the investigation. Nothing here is normal. Nothing here is resolved. And that's exactly what turns this case into a real obsession for investigators, conspiracists, and lovers of unsolved mysteries around the world. A case that mixes true crime with elements that sound supernatural, as if something or someone had decided that certain truths could never be known. Be prepared to question everything, because over the next few minutes, you will know details that the police ignored. You will hear reports that were never included in the official documents, and you will understand why, for many, the disappearance of the Soder brothers was not a simple tragedy, but rather the result of a dark and cruel plan, where each piece was carefully fitted together to confuse, scare, and, above all, silence. And the more you try to understand, the more everything seems to slip through your fingers. What started as a family loss turns into a labyrinth of contradictions, lies, cover-ups, and terrifying clues. Such as, for example, the strange object found in the backyard of the house days later, or the anonymous photo sent years later with a cryptic message, or the heart, or what they said was a heart, buried in a box of dynamite. And who decided that this would be part of the official report? An insurance salesman who had threatened to kill the family's children weeks earlier. Is this in any investigation manual? It's exactly this kind of aberration that will make you doubt everything you've learned about justice, security, and truth. Because in this case, justice never came. Security was an illusion, and the truth, perhaps she was buried alive. And the scariest thing, this didn't happen in an isolated place in the middle of nowhere. This happened in the United States, in an ordinary city, with neighbors, with firefighters, with police, with newspapers. And no one, absolutely no one, has been able to explain where these children are. That's why this story needs to be told. Not so that you sleep peacefully, but so that, like the families of these children, you refuse to accept silence for an answer. Because at the end of the day, the question that still echoes is not how did they die, but yes, did they really die? Are you ready to see what's left after the flames? So stay with me, because the story is just beginning. But what is really frightening is not the silence of the authorities. It is the silence of the fire, because when the fire goes out, it usually leaves traces, bones, teeth, organic waste, some kind of evidence that death passed through there. But in the case of the Soder brothers, the fire seemed to have been selective. He destroyed everything except the questions. No body, no fragments, nothing. George, the father, did not accept what the eyes saw, nor could it. The morning after the fire, while smoke was still hanging in the air, he knelt before what was once his home and made a radical decision. He would take the truth into his own hands. He rented a bulldozer, threw 5 meters of earth over the ashes, and built a makeshift memorial there. But this was not a tomb. It was a scream. A monument to the denial of the official narrative. Because George didn't believe his children had died in the fire. He believed they had been taken. And with each passing day, more evidence reinforced this hypothesis. In the same month as the incident, a woman in Charleston reported seeing 5 children in a car, accompanied by 2 Italian-looking men. She tried to interact with the children. One of the men stared back at her with a look that didn't ask for silence. He imposed it. The woman felt her body freeze, fell silent, and never saw them again. But that moment was marked in her memory as something out of the natural order of things. A displaced scene, with the kind of strangeness that we only perceive when instinct screams, "This is not normal." The mother, Jenny, refused to accept the fire department's report. According to them, the fire was caused by a failure in the electrical wiring, but she knew something that others ignored. Weeks before the tragedy, a professional electrician had done a thorough inspection of the house and assured her that everything was in perfect condition, and more. If the fire had really been electric, how to explain the fact that the lights were on during the fire? Jenny remembered clearly. The moment the smell of smoke filled the room, she saw the downstairs lights still on. This, in itself, overturned the official explanation. And if something already smelled of sabotage, the reports that emerged later confirmed this impression. Days before the fire, 2 unknown men were seen hanging around the house. One of them even asked about his children. Another watched silently as the children returned from school. And interestingly, on the night of the tragedy, a strange call woke Jenny just before the flames started. An unknown voice asked for someone who didn't live there, laughed, and hung up. Soon after, Jenny heard a bang on the roof, as if something heavy had been thrown there. Then a metallic sound rolling. Less than an hour later, the house was on fire. Coincidence? Perhaps. But then, days later, among the wreckage, the family found a strange object. A metal shell, resembling a small incendiary bomb. George believed that it was a pineapple bomb, a napalm grenade used in wars. It wasn't something you'd find by chance in post-war America. It was something placed there for a purpose. Meanwhile, the behavior of the authorities was, at the very least, suspicious. When the family asked the FBI to take over the case, local authorities refused. They gave no explanation. They just said, "It's not necessary." And when they hired a private detective, he discovered something even more alarming. The man who had threatened George weeks earlier, saying that his house would burn down and his children would pay for the offenses against Mussolini, was the same man who was on the jury that declared the fire an accident. That's right. The man who swore to destroy that family. He was one of those responsible for judging the case. Do you still believe that this was just a domestic accident? The detective also discovered that Fire Chief F.J. Morris had told some people that he had found a human heart among the ashes. And what did you do with it? He buried it in a box of dynamite behind the house. When confronted, Morris ended up showing the place where the object was buried. But what was unearthed? It was a cow's liver, raw. No sign of having passed through any fire. He claimed to have done this to comfort the family. But since when do you comfort someone with a grotesque lie? These are not coincidences. They are pieces of a dark puzzle that seem to have been arranged with the sole purpose of covering up the truth. The case became so perplexing that in 1949, the Soder themselves hired a pathologist, Dr. Oscar B. Hunter, to excavate the land where the house once stood. During the excavations, he found fragments of human vertebrae. Finally, a clue? No. The Smithsonian's analysis revealed that the bones belonged to a 17-year-old teenager, older than any of the missing children, and that they bore no marks of exposure to fire. The conclusion? Those bones were probably already mixed in the earth even before the fire. The question that remains is, where did they come from? And more, where are the bones that should be there? With each new answer, more questions arose. And none of them led to what was expected, peace. Because this was not a case that offered closure. It was a, labyrinth where each exit led to a darker alley. And as much as the family dug, investigated, denounced, the truth was still buried. In 1968, a new twist set the case on fire. Jenny received a letter. Inside, a photograph of a young man with features eerily similar to those of Louis, one of the missing children. Behind the photo, a cryptic message. Louis Soder, I love my brother Frankie, ill boys. 90132. or 35. The letter had no sender. The postage stamp was from Kentucky. And the content? It seemed written by someone who knew exactly who he was talking to. Jenny and George hired another detective to follow this lead. He went to Kentucky and was never seen again. That's right, disappeared. He disappeared like children. It disappeared like the latter, like the calls that didn't go through, like the bodies that never appeared. This story does not end. It just folds in on itself, like a broken mirror reflecting infinite versions of a truth that no one wants to look in the face. And the strangest thing about all this? No one has ever sought out this detective. No police report, no notes in the local newspaper, no investigation into his disappearance. As if everyone had agreed, silently, that he should disappear. And with him, what could be the last chance to find the children, or at least to confirm that they were still alive. By then, the story had already crossed the boundaries of a missing person case. It had become an abyss, a constant echo in time, reverberating. Among people who swear they have seen the children in other states, in convents, in shelters, in foreign colonies. People who reported interrupted conversations, scared looks, strange reactions when the name Soder was mentioned. And despite all these reports, nothing was concrete. No physical proof, just the certainty that something was hidden, and very well hidden. The billboard erected by George on the side of the road became a landmark, a monument to resistance against oblivion. For more than 40 years, he stayed there, with photos of his missing children, dates, ages, theories, denouncing the inefficiency of the authorities, the negligence of the state, and, most of all, the frightening possibility of a cover-up. It was impossible to pass by and not feel something, a lump in the throat, a weight on the shoulders, the feeling of being faced with an injustice that has never been repaired. The billboard wasn't just an appeal, it was a public accusation, a silent cry against the EU system. And this is what differentiates this case from so many others. The family did not accept the official version. He did not accept the end. They kept digging even when everyone was saying, "Stop, you're obsessed." But perhaps it was this obsession that kept them alive. Because when the whole world refuses to look at something, you have two options. Turn your face to, or stare into the abyss and keep asking. Jenny chose the second option. She spent years testing animal bones. He burned. Ribs, jaws, fragments, to understand what really should have been left of a human body after a 45-minute fire. And do you know what she discovered? That the bones always remained, always. No home test, no matter how intense, could completely eliminate the evidence. And yet, the remains of his children never turned up. How to explain this? Jenny also visited crematoriums. He talked to employees. He has heard, repeatedly, that even the bodies most destroyed by fire leave marks. The heat required to completely incinerate a human body is very high and needs to be maintained for hours, which was not the case in that fire. There, everything went very fast, very superficial, very much convenient. In any other case, the lack of remains would raise a formal investigation, but not here. Here, there was a rush to close everything. Reports were issued with an almost offensive speed. The death certificates were filled out even before a complete forensic examination. Most unsettlingly, neighbors' reports of strange men, trucks prowling, and suspicious activity on the night of the fire were completely ignored. George spent years following leads. A letter came from New York, another from St. Louis. One woman claimed to have seen Martha, the eldest daughter, in a convent. Another said the children were with relatives far away from Jenny's family in Florida, and George followed each of these trails, personally, without support from anyone, only with the strength of a father, who refused to accept what the whole world tried to impose on him, mourning. But what you see more than pain is a pattern of obstruction, silencing, of fragile versions presented as absolute truths. The house caught fire, but nothing caught as much as doubt. The Soder case spread like a whisper in the dark. People commented but lowered their tone. Experts argued but avoided conclusions, because no one wanted to be the next to disappear. The psychological impact on the family was profound. Jenny started to dress in black every day. For 40 years, George built a fence around the memorial, as if trying to protect an exposed wound from the outside world. And Sylvia, the youngest daughter, grew up carrying the weight of a truth in half. She was only 2 years old when it all happened, but she spent her life being reminded, daily, that something was missing, something that no one could explain. And this is where the story gains another layer, that of time. Because time, in this case, has not cured anything. It only deepened the mystery. With each new decade, New versions, new files, new reports emerged. In 1989, when Jenny passed away, Sylvia promised that she would never let the story die. And to this day, it fulfills that promise. Because despite everything, despite the time, the silence, and the absence of answers, the case is still pulsating. It pulsates in forgotten archives, in anonymous letters, in misidentified photos, in clues left like crumbs in a field of lies. And if you think this all sounds like conspiracy theory, think again. Because in 1945, no one was talking about child trafficking, organized kidnappings, or silent networks operating within American society itself. But today, we know that these things exist, which have always existed, which were just well hidden, just like the Soder brothers. So the question that hammers the mind of anyone who dives into this case is not, how did this happen? But rather, who allowed this to happen? Who benefited from silence? Who sabotaged the trucks? Who ripped out the ladder? Who hung up the phones? Who buried a liver saying it was a heart? Who wrote that letter in 1968? And more importantly, why? So far, we are already immersed in a sea of questions. And yet, the tide does not go out. There are still hidden stories, undisclosed names, locations that perhaps hide more than the dust of time can cover. And so, this story continues, because it is not closed. She is alive, on each loose thread, in each ignored evidence, on every child's face stamped on that billboard, and above all, in each person who refuses to believe that this is just another tragedy without explanation. The disappearance of the Soder brothers is an open wound in the heart of the United States, a scar that crosses generations, an uncomfortable reminder that not every crime leaves blood on the ground. Sometimes he leaves only silence. And now, more than ever, it's time to face that silence. When you, are faced with a case like this, you are not just dealing with a tragic event from the past. It is, in fact, setting foot inside a territory where the rules of what is right, what is legal, and what is logical simply collapse. The Soder brothers case is not about a fire. It's about a structural flaw in everything we believe in as a society. Child protection, justice, unbiased investigations, institutional trust. All of this was imploded that morning, and the shards, to this day, have not been collected. Imagine being a 9-year-old child, waking up to the smell of smoke, hearing a bang on the roof, and seconds later, seeing the world around you turn into flames. Now imagine that, in the midst of chaos, a door opens. Not for freedom, but for something much darker. A car, a strange face, a dry command. Come in, and what comes next? Long roads, silence, menstruation, new names, and the previous life. Christmas, siblings, parents, becoming just a distant whisper, almost like a forgotten dream. Is this theory? Perhaps. But if it were just theory, why so many witnesses? Why so many clues sent over decades, always anonymously, always with fragments that only the family would recognize? Why to this day does this case continue to appear on lists of America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries? The answer is simple, because it is not closed. And because deep down, something inside all of us feels that this story is still moving. Some say that George and Jenny's children were taken in revenge. Others believe they were sold to an illegal adoption network, something that has been documented in other American cities around the same time. There are also those who defend a more radical version, that they were taken for political reasons, as a way to silence George, who openly criticized Mussolini's regime and had enemies among the Italian-American community of Fayetteville. Which of these versions is real? No? All? The fact is that the absence of legitimate official answers makes room for everything, even for the impossible. And this openness to the impossible is precisely what makes this case so powerful within the universe of supernatural crimes and real mysteries. He is on the threshold of what can be tasted and what can only be felt. And this stirs the most primitive emotions of the public: fear, indignation, hope. Because at the end of the day, what hurts is not only the disappearance itself, it is the feeling of helplessness, that something serious happened, and no one did anything. Jenny, even as she grew older, never stopped searching. She received letters, tapes, photographs, notes with anonymous letters, often accompanied by disguised threats. One of the letters said only, "Stop digging. What you find can destroy you." And yet, she kept going, because stopping, for her, would be like killing her children a second time. And you realize, at this point in the story, that we're dealing with one of the most strong-willed mothers in the history of criminal cases. She didn't scream on television. He did not seek fame. She was seeking the truth, a truth that consumed her, but also kept her standing. Every time someone said, "Forget it, Jenny," she responded with silence, because those who lost 5 children at the same time do not forget. Never. Not for a second. And Sylvia, the youngest daughter, grew up in this atmosphere. She had no memories of her missing siblings, but she felt their absence every day. I felt it in the eye, photos, at the improvised altar, in the tears of the mother in front of the stove, in the lost eyes of the father looking at nothing. And when he grew up, he took it upon himself to keep the case alive, because as his mother said, as long as someone remembers, they still exist. And this is where you realize that the Soder case is no longer just a horror story. He became a symbol, a grim reminder that the truth can be buried alive, but never completely. There will always be cracks. There will always be voices that refuse to be silent. There will always be those who stand up, even if they are afraid, to say, "This is not right." And that's why this video exists. To keep the flame burning, to refuse oblivion, to repeat out loud that 5 children disappeared in absolutely bizarre circumstances, and that the answers they gave to their parents never made sense. The city of Fayetteville has changed. The house where it all happened no longer exists. The billboard has been removed. But the case, this one is still alive. In files, in documentaries, on online forums, in podcasts, and above all, in the collective memory of those who refuse to swallow easy truths. You might even think it's overkill, which is perhaps just another sad story among many, but I invite you to do one thing. Stop now and ask yourself, what would you do if they were your children? Would you accept a hasty report? Would you accept a buried liver as evidence? Would you accept that no one looked for the detective who disappeared? Could you sleep with that? George and Jenny couldn't. Neither did Sylvia. And if you've made it this far, you probably won't be able to either. Because this story doesn't leave you alone. She stays, echoing, biting, whispering that something is wrong, that there is still something hidden, that there is still more. And it does. Because there are archives that have never been opened to the public. There are witnesses who, to this day, refuse to speak. There are names that have disappeared from the records. And there are families who swear they have recognized, in their own old albums, faces very similar to those of the Soder brothers. Coincidence? Or part of a much larger puzzle? What if that's just the tip of the iceberg? What if other cases like this exist but never made it to the media? And if there are entire networks of covert disappearances, masked as domestic tragedies, accidental, when in fact they are coordinated, systematic, planned actions? Maybe it's hard to believe that now. If until now the story already seemed unbelievable, this is where it begins to cross the line of what we call known reality. Because when the details start to line up, you realize that what seemed like a coincidence, it may actually be part of something much more planned, something deliberate, something sinister. George, the father, had always believed that the fire had not been accidental. He knew this not only from his instinct, but from the facts. Weeks before the tragedy, he hired a certified electrician to overhaul all of the house's wiring. The inspection confirmed there was no risk, no exposed cables, no risk of short circuit. So how is it possible that the official version of the fire continues to say that it all started due to an electrical defect? More disturbing than the official lie was the warning George received shortly before the fire. An insurance salesman, angered by George's refusal to sign a contract, reportedly shouted something that sounded more like a curse than a threat. "Your house is going to burn down, and his children will pay." Words that echo today with an almost prophetic weight, and that come back to the surface like a punch in the stomach when connected to what would come next. On the night of the fire, Jenny wakes up startled by the phone ringing. An unknown voice asks for a person who does not live there. Laugh, turn off, and then, minutes later, a metallic sound on the roof, a dry impact. Something rolling, as if a hand bomb had been thrown. The next day, among the wreckage, Jenny finds an artifact. A metal cylinder similar to incendiary grenades used during the war. An object that should never be in an ordinary residence in West Virginia. An object that seemed to have been made to provoke exactly that, fire. George tried to climb the stairs to save his children, but the stairs, which always leaned against the side of the house, had disappeared. The trucks, which could be used as a support platform, did not turn on. And worse, witnesses claimed to have seen a man, that same night, tampering with the engines of George's vehicles. The objective seemed clear: to prevent any rescue attempt. You begin to realize that nothing that night was random. Everything seemed meticulously calculated. The fire, the failure of the vehicles, the absence of the ladder, the absurd delay of the firefighters, who arrived 7 hours later, even though they were only 4 kilometers from the site. All of this, combined, does not point to an accident, but for an execution, a silent orchestration to erase more than one house, to erase the existence of 5 children. And it is exactly here that the case plunges into even darker terrain. Days after the fire, the first reports of sightings emerge. A woman claims to have seen the children inside a car passing at high speed during the fire. Another, who worked in a restaurant about 80 kilometers away, claims to have served breakfast to 5 children accompanied by 2 men and 2 women, all with Italian features. When she tried to interact with the little ones, she was cut off by an icy look from one of the adults, who seemed to say, "Not one more word." A third report, even more disturbing, came from a hotel in Charleston, where an employee claims to have seen 4 of the children. She says she tried to get closer, but the adults who accompanied them reacted with hostility. No one has ever been able to verify these clues conclusively, but the pattern that repeats itself in the reports is the most frightening. Unknown adults, silent children, abruptly interrupted interactions, and a trail of fear in the air. Meanwhile, the fire chief, the same person who arrived 7 hours late, makes an even more absurd revelation. He told a priest in the city that he had found something among the rubble, the heart of a child. But instead of handing it over to forensics, he buried it in a box of dynamite behind the house. When the site was excavated, what was found was a raw liver. No sign of burning, without any indication that he had passed through the fire. The official explanation? He would have done this to comfort the family. Now I ask you, since when is lying about finding a child's remains comforting? What kind of perverse logic is this? This is no consolation. This is manipulation. It's macabre theater. It's another layer in the cover-up, and more evidence emerges. In 1949, George and Jenny hire Nchio, independent pathologist, Oscar B. Hunter, to excavate the grounds. He finds fragments of human vertebrae. Hope? Perhaps. But when the bones are sent to the Smithsonian Institute, the answer is a new slap in the face. The fragments belong to someone around 17 years old, much older than any of the missing children, and, even more intriguing, with no signs of having been exposed to fire. The official theory? The bones were already mixed in the soil, coming from somewhere else. That's right. The only human remains found. They were not from the children. You begin to understand that the story isn't just badly told. It's being actively manipulated. At this point, the FBI shows interest in taking over the case, but local police deny help. He rejects federal support. And once again, you have to ask yourself, who denies help from the FBI when 5 children go missing under bizarre circumstances? What is the reason? What were they trying to hide? The siege closes even closer in 1968 when an anonymous letter arrives at the family home. Inside it, a photo. A young adult, with features eerily similar to Louis, one of the missing children. On the back of the image, a cryptic phrase, Louis Soder. I love my brother Frankie. Lil Boys 90132 or 35. No sender. Kentucky postage stamp. Disturbing writing. An even stranger message. George hires a detective to go after this clue. He travels to Kentucky and is never seen again. Not even a phone call. Not a single ticket. Nothing. What happened to this investigator? Has anyone silenced him? Did he discover something that could not be revealed? The theories gain strength. Some point to a kidnapping orchestrated by members of the city's own Italian community, in retaliation for George's political positions. Others raise the hypothesis of child trafficking, something we now know was a much more common practice than we would like to admit in past decades. There are also those who speak of secret societies, government experiments, and even the involvement of local elite figures. Yes, it sounds extreme, but when all logical explanations fail, what's left? The absence of bones, the staircase that disappears, the truck sabotaged, the war artifact in the backyard, the refusal to open a federal investigation, the organ buried in secret, the letter with clues, the missing detective, the silence of the authorities, the sightings not investigated. This is not madness. This is a pattern, and this is where you come in. If you've made it this far, it means you're not satisfied with the official version, that something inside you is also bothered by this story, who feels, even if intuitively, that this is bigger than it seems. Then comment below, this cannot have been an accident. Or, if you prefer, leave only an I saw, because who sees? No. And pay attention, because there is still more. At this point, it is no longer just a case. What you are witnessing is a pain that crosses generations, a type of scar that never heals. Jenny, the mother who survived the fire and the absence of her children, never had a single day of peace. Never again. She didn't just suffer. She refused to accept the lie. And this refusal became his life mission, not as a theory, but as a kind of personal ritual. Jenny has spent decades doing tests at home. He would take animal bones, pork ribs, bone-in pieces of meat, and put them on the fire. Hours of combustion, high temperature. He tried with his own hands to understand how far a body can be destroyed by the flames. And what was always left there, at the bottom of the oven, in the ashes of the backyard, it was irrefutable proof. The bone survives. Always. And if even a home experiment shows that human remains resist fire, why did the bodies of the 5 children simply evaporate? Jenny reached out to experts. He wrote letters, traveled. He spoke with crematorium workers, pathologists, coroners. They all said the same thing. To reduce a body to nothing, it takes temperatures above 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for hours, the kind of heat that didn't exist in the fire of that wooden house. The fire barely lasted 45 minutes. And yet, not a fragment of bone, not a tooth, no nails. This is not only strange, this is impossible. And even in the face of the impossible, Jenny didn't stop. Years later, she would receive a mysterious letter at home, addressed to her, and only to her. Inside, a black and white photograph. A young man, dark eyes, thin nose, arched eyebrow. A disturbing resemblance to Louis, the 9-year-old boy who disappeared in the fire. On the back of the photo, a handwritten phrase without immediate meaning, but full of emotional code. Louis Soder, I love my brother Frankie. Lil Boys 90132 or 35. There was no sender. The letter had been sent from the state of Kentucky. Jenny froze. He showed George. And once again, hope, that hope that had already died so many times, was reborn with a strength that hurts. They hired a new private detective, and he went. He traveled to Kentucky with the mission of finding out who the man in the photo was, and he was never seen again. That's right, never again. The detective disappeared. There was no police report, no official search request. The man simply dissolved into the same kind of silence that had engulfed the family's children. And then, the doubt is no longer about what happened to the children, but about who else is involved in all this. How many people know the truth? How many did they help to hide? What's more, who decided that Jenny and George would never have their answers? After that, George fell ill, and it didn't last long. He died in 1969 at the age of 74. He died with his head full of questions, without a tomb to visit, without a body to bury. He died with the same thought that had accompanied him since that early December morning. They are still alive, and I failed to save them. Jenny lived for another 20 years, 2 long, dark cycles of time, where each dawn was yet another reminder that half of his family had been ripped away, and the other half went on without knowing why. Jenny wore black every day, not for fashion, but for mourning, a mourning that has never ceased, a visual protest, a mark of resistance against oblivion. In the living room of the house, she set up an altar, a small shrine with photos, flowers, and relics. Sometimes she talked to her children there, in a low voice. He asked for forgiveness. He asked for news. He asked for a sign, and the world followed. People moved to another city. The newspapers stopped covering it. But the billboard, that billboard remained. Property, like a monument to pain. As a warning, the truth has not yet been told. With the photos of the 5 children, with details of the case, with direct accusations to the authorities, and a question in big letters. What really happened to our children? For 40 years, that billboard stayed there, by the roadside, looking into the eyes of those who passed by. Witnesses say they saw people stop, get out of the car, read in silence, cry. It was as if that simple structure, made of wood and paper, had a soul. As if it were a cry contained in time, an eternal appeal, a grim reminder that delayed justice, it is justice denied. And then, Sylvia was left, the youngest daughter. He was only 2 years old when it all happened. He doesn't remember his brothers, but it grew up among echoes, between whispers, between photos that she learned to memorize even before she understood the meaning of the word death. Sylvia grew up as a witness to emptiness, a child who survived, and who carries to this day the weight of being the only bridge between before and after. She inherited the mission. When Jenny passed away, Sylvia promised, "I will never let this story die." And he kept his promise. He took the case to websites, forums, documentaries. He told the story in interviews. He sought to digitize files, rekindle clues, attract attention. And to this day, she keeps trying, even if everything seems dark, even if nothing else makes sense. And here's where you come in, because now that you know this story, you also carry this weight. You saw it too. He also listened. He also knows. And knowledge demands one thing: responsibility. It's no longer just a case. It is a real riddle with no solution, an open wound in American history, a grim warning that not every tragedy comes with a body. Some come only with a silence that destroys more than fire. Maybe the Soder brothers are dead. Maybe they are alive. Perhaps they grew up with new names in other states, without ever knowing where they came from. Perhaps they have been silenced. Perhaps they have been protected. Nobody knows. But what no one can deny, it's just that the official explanation doesn't add up. It never closed. And the question that does not shut up, the question that haunts all this, it is, if the authorities knew that the story was flawed, why did they insist so much on burying it? And did they bury only history? Or have they also buried the truth? And that's why you need to leave your comment now. I want to know what you think. Write down here. It doesn't end like this. Or, if you felt the same outrage this family has felt for decades, just type, "They deserve the truth." This will show that you are here, attentive, awake, and ready to go deeper. Because I promise, what's next? It's even more disturbing.